happy to be with you. I'm sorry I have to abbreviate my lecture. I have another a meeting that I need to be at, a planning meeting for next year because it's almost the end of the semester. Oh my God, no! So I'm happy to come and talk to you and be invited to come and talk to you about actually, Alvin doesn't know this, maybe he does, but community is my absolute favorite topic to speak about. And I just wrote a chapter in a book collection called Racial Ecologies, and it's actually about Octavia Butler, a famous science fiction writer who wrote Kindred and Parable of the Sower and many other famous, really popular novels and short stories like Bloodchild. And my chapter was about this concept, rassemblage and collective reflexivity in Octavia Butler's work, and particularly in Parable of the Sower. So I love talking, this is not my discipline really, Area E, I usually teach in Area C, but I do write, talk about, and think all the time about community and how to build community, and I think that it's very important for us to always keep that at the forefront of everything that we do, whether you're in leadership, or whether you're just an everyday, citizen, whether you're, just a member of this planet, to think about how we can work collectively, to be a collective, and to think collectively. So, a new believing in a word that is very important, connectedness, right? Interconnectedness, interconnection, or rassemblage, collective reflexivity. And so this is a picture from the 2014 People's Climate March in New York, which was huge. And one of the things that was distinctive about this particular march was its diversity, that it had people of diverse backgrounds coming together to defend the planet, to defend the environment, to defend the earth. And environmentalism is often seen as being a very homogeneous and more sort of a white movement. And the collection that I have the chapter in is trying to challenge that. It's trying to say that this is an issue that people of color, marginalized people, disenfranchised people have always been involved with, beginning with the indigenous communities, protecting the earth and fighting for environmental justice. So I want to kind of take it to this idea of the limits of possessive, what we call possessive individualism, from Angela Davis in the 1970s, the campaign to save her, and from an unjust imprisonment, she was a political prisoner in the 1970s, and she wrote a biography, and it was, her autobiography was titled If They Come in the Morning, and she wrote it while she was in prison. She was an activist, and she was someone who was involved with, not a Black Panther herself, but involved with the Black Panthers, the Black Power movement, and particularly with prison reform. And so that's one of the reasons her relationship to the rebellions around prison in the 1970s is the reason why she herself became in prison. You can look that up. The history is long and deep and very interesting. But one of the things she says in her autobiography is that repression is the response of an increasingly desperate imperialist ruling clique to contain an otherwise uncontrollable and growing popular disaffection, leading ultimately, she says, we think, and you notice the pronoun use there, we think, to the revolutionary transformation of society. That's Angela Davis. What's our local prison and that you know about? San Quentin, right? So if you're thinking about her connection to this locally, she was involved in some very momentous events around prison riots in prison, the struggle for prison reform, and what she likes to say from that point in the 70s, even to now still, the abolition of prisons, thinking about prison abolition. So that's one of those revolutionary transformations that she's alluding to. So possessive individualism comes really from political theory, and it is defined, McPherson actually came up with this term and has a book called The Political Theory of Possessive Individualism, in which he says an individual should be conceived, thought of, as the sole proprietor of his or her skills and owes nothing to society for those skills. And should really be thought of as an independent entity, right? Within the context of possessive individualism, writes Patricia Hill Collins, political rights then become viewed as commodities, as things one possesses as a commodity, something that American citizens possess or own as individuals, solely, I might add, as individuals, when tied to a racial system that writes off, however, large numbers of people who are not seen as individuals, but as members of groups, and merely as members of groups. This possessive individualism also, she writes and theorizes, fosters an irresponsible individualism. So I want to connect the idea about community to the idea actually of care, and the idea, again, of interrelatedness. And you see there's a book there by Gillian Daly, and a really important book called The Ideologies of Caring. And this notion of who do we care for? How about people who aren't necessarily able to use that political capital that McPherson talks about, and this notion of the individualism as a commodity, right? Being the sole proprietor of his or her skills, and take that and are able to care for themselves. What about people who aren't able to care for themselves? What do we do with people in our society who need help, who need to be cared for, who need assistance? How does possessive individualism work for those members of our society? Do we just leave them to their own devices, right? Do we abandon them? So this Daly is really trying to get us to think about ideology, political ideology, and the way we move in the world politically, connected to our identity as social beings, because we're not just merely political beings, but we are also social beings. So that in feminist studies, there's an important critique of possessive individualism. So this is just a poem that you all are probably familiar with. It gets recirculated all the time. It gets revised to fit whatever particular movement or moment, political moment is on the fore. And so I don't know, this is the context really for the title of Angela Davis's autobiography, If They Come in the Morning. And again, it's pretty famous, so you will recognize some of these words, I think. First, they came for the socialist, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionist, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. So this is another way of thinking about individualism, possessive individualism, and of course, community and collectivism. What is our responsibility to one another, to the larger collective? So that's what I want to talk about. Another context, really just briefly, is James Baldwin, who is very famed in our society, very well regarded and respected as a writer and as an intellectual and as a thinker. And he wrote about Angela Davis's imprisonment. While she was in prison, he wrote an essay called An Open Letter to My Sister. Notice the use again of this term of affinity, of kindred relation, sister, They were not related biologically, but he called her my sister, Angela Davis. He wrote, quote, "A sister in prison battling for her life, not simply be an instrument of someone else's profit." There's this running theme about commodification of people and profit. "For if they come for her in the morning, they will be coming for us at night." And Davis herself wrote, "If they come for me in the morning, they will be coming for you in the night." That our relation to one another is inextricable. Eventually, the relation will reveal itself. And it can reveal itself in a positive way or in a negative way, depending on how we nurture or we don't nurture those connections to one another. So here is Maya Angelou saying, "The rock cries out to us today." Another kind of relation to the earth, specifically, the rock being personified to call out, right? "You may stand upon me," she says, "but do not hide your face from me." The rock is saying, do not hide your face. Do not go away, right, from our connection to one another. That was in the 1993 inauguration when she read the inaugural poem. So the 3C community is what I call the 3C community. Caring, first and foremost. You have to care. Because if you don't care, then if it doesn't begin with care, then it can go nowhere, right? So caring. Compassion. What's another word for compassion that we like to use? It starts with an E. Empathy, right? Empathy. Seeing yourself in someone else's struggle, someone else's experience. It may not be your experience, but you can see yourself. My mother used to say, don't criticize someone unless you've walked in their shoes. How many people have heard that phrase, right? Do not talk. That was a big thing with my mom, always, when my brother would do something horrible. Once he did something really, and I won't tell you what it was, but it was bad. And, of course, the immediate response was to criticize him and just say, well, that was horrible that you, and she would always stop us. Stop. No. If you haven't walked in those shoes, don't do that. You need to think about the other person and empathize with them. You don't have to agree with them, and you certainly can challenge someone and say, I don't agree with you, but you should always have compassion, empathy. One of the most, I always do that. The most famous novel of the 19th century was the most famous best-selling novel of the 19th century because of this. Do you all know what it was? It was sold more copies than any other book aside from the Bible in the 19th century. Uncle Tom's Cabin. And Stowe uses this to draw in the white reader, particularly the white female reader, particularly the white middle-class female reader. She draws those readers in by the use of this idea of empathizing with who? The slave mother. How would you feel if your child was taken away from you? By law. Right? How would you feel? So connectedness is the third C here. Drawing a connection between yourself and another. So community is, to me, a kind of dancing mind idea. Toni Morrison wrote, "The piece I am thinking of is the dance," because dancing together as an ensemble, "of an open mind when it engages another equally open one." It produces a dance, a moment of opportunity, creativity, possibility. So let's go to this idea of collective. How do you do that? How do you dance with another, especially if someone that you don't necessarily agree with, right? You don't see eye to eye. I don't know why he's doing this toggle thing, but I'm just gonna ignore it. Because technology is always trying to dominate me, and I'm very sort of determined not to let it. So this term rassemblage is a Haitian Creole term, and it means assembly, compilation, compiling things together, enlisting, drawing in, and also regrouping. Here you see a picture from the 50s, actually, school desegregation or school segregation. You see this one black student in a class of white students. But what I love about this picture is that you see them looking at one another, and they're really, in a way, although they're opposites and they're being opposed to one another in this photograph, they really are mirrored. They're mirrors of one another. They're looking at one another and they're seeing themselves in each other. And even the way that they look, if you look really closely at this photograph, you can see the similarities. You can focus on the differences and the isolation and the separation and segregation, but you also could focus in this photograph on the reflection, right? Because they're both young women, little girls. They have a kind of connection that you can feel in this picture they're trying to draw out, that the photographer wants us to see the angst, frankly, the tension, but also what is the relation? You always have to start thinking about what is my relation to the larger world, to another person. So in a text called Groundings on Rassemblage with M. Jacquet Alexander, she elaborates on this concept, this Haitian Creole concept, as a necessary project of reassembling ourselves and reimagination. She says, quote, it's a constant element of taking the supreme self, because we never want to disregard ourselves, our individuality, right? With a collective reflexivity, seeing ourselves in another again, which provides for her a pathway to possibility and potential. What is the possibility in this picture? What is the potential in a relationship that can be drawn between these two opposing forces, if you will? So when we begin to see ourselves in others, and then others in ourselves, it can act as a mirror that not only reflects, but connects us. And this, in turn, can create the potential for growth. Think about how strong we could be as a community, as opposed to all of these separate factions. Think about how positive and how much potential there is in embracing difference as opposed to fearing it, which we know leads not only to repression of people's rights and their individual rights, as well as their group rights, if we want to think about group rights, which I don't like to think about too much, because I don't think groups have rights or individuals have rights. I think we exist in a, it would be wonderful if we didn't have to establish the notion of rights. If we could exist harmoniously, I'll use that 70s term, I'll just go there. But think about, because what happens when we're trying to really be fixated on that, what happens is that we get afraid that someone else is going to take my rights. And then we get into fear and limitation as opposed to possibility, expansiveness, openness, that open mind dancing again. Think of that open mind again. So I want to think about myself a little bit. Who am I? Because you should always think about who you are. How many people went to the investiture last week? Right? And one of the things, we went to the library and saw the, and it's still up, I encourage you to go look at Dr. Sakaki's The Exhibit. How many people have seen the exhibit in the library? Excellent. So the theme of that exhibit is I am because. I am because of all of these connections that I have. Connections to my family, connections to mentors, connections to friends, connections to my ancestors. I am because of all of these aspects of who I am. They all have contributed to my identity. And it's really wonderful to see in the exhibit and last week in the investiture that idea of bringing together all these various elements of who Dr. Sakaki is, right? To thinking about her role here as I said, a conductor, her role in facilitating a collaboration, a collaborative environment. And so I was thinking about that myself. I had thought about that long before the investiture, but I am not just an individual, but I am a granddaughter, a daughter, a mother, a sister, as I said, a niece, a cousin, I'm an aunt, I'm a wife, a partner, teacher, I'm a colleague, I'm a coworker, and I'm a friend. But most importantly, I'm a species being of the earth. I'm a member of a collective, reflexive community. I'm a member of something. I don't live in isolation. One of my favorite things I always bring up is, and I can never remember the name of the movie, but the Tom Hanks one with the volleyball. Is it a volleyball or a basketball? It's got to be a volleyball. It can't be a basketball. Castaway. What is the ball? It is a volleyball, right? I think that's significant, right? That it's a volleyball. Because volleyball is a serious team sport, if you don't know. Basketball is too, but you know, you can have a LeBron James in basketball and then it's, you know, whatever. He can just do it, right? Practically by himself. Steph Curry, I know you all don't want me, I know how it is here. Please forgive me. I meant a Steph Curry, because I know how you all are. I meant Curry. I didn't mean to say LeBron. I meant to say Steph Curry doing the three-pointers, right? But in volleyball, you're not going to have that, right? So he has this, you know, he's cast away by himself. That film is interesting. Film is such a brilliant and powerful medium, because in that movie, you're meant to, as an audience member, and you know, you're meant to read that thing as being super negative, super like stressful, and oh my God, when is he going to get off this island? When is he going to get back to his peeps? So anybody, right? But this volleyball, right? There's a nice symbolism that they're doing there. I don't know how many people grew up in where I grew up, probably Alvin too. Remember Gilligan's Island? Yeah, hated that show. Hated it. Why? Why did we hate it? Hello. You're like, you are torturing me every week? Are you serious? Right? And so we're social beings. We don't want to be on an island with a volleyball, dressing it up, trying to talk to it, trying to, authenticate some kind of relationship. So that tells you how important connection is. So here's what, I love this term that Jackie Alexander talks about, and she used the term intersubjectivity, because we're all individuals and we're subjects, and subject position is something literature folk like to talk about all the time. But what about intersubjectivity? What about that idea? So I'll read this quote from her. She says, quote, think about the immense generosity and immense grace of the earth. If we were to think about it in a secular way, not a religious way, but in a secular way, we would have to think about all of the work that it takes to produce us, right? All of the people who, for instance, have sewn our clothes, unless you make your own, unless you sew your own clothes, made our shoes. Raise your hand if you make shoes. Harvested our food. Food. Raise your hand if you harvested your own food that you ate today, this morning. Raise your hand if you harvested that food that breakfast you had, or that you harvested your lunch that you're going to eat. All of the people who have produced us just for one morning. How did you get here? Who pays your tuition? If you pay your tuition, you have a job, don't you? Who employs you? What kind of work do you do? Who consumes whatever it is that you produce? There's no way to get out of the relations, right? Just for a day. How you function in one day, think of all the people that have contributed to what you have to do in a day. Let's not even go through the entire day, she says. Let's just take the morning. Consider all the people that it took to produce us that we didn't have a hand in, that we don't know, that we don't acknowledge. We didn't have a hand, for instance, even in the rising of the sun. We didn't have a hand in the appearing moon. We didn't have a hand in any of those things. And yet, without them, we wouldn't know life on this planet. That is in serious jeopardy. It's very serious jeopardy. Unless you don't breathe oxygen. Is there anybody here who doesn't breathe oxygen? Because then you might be okay. Might. Right? So, these relations are crucial to our existence. It's not just a sort of 70s, 60s, 70s hippie, oh, here's Professor Kim with the hippie thing. No, we wouldn't be able to live without these relations. And if the relations are not harmonious, if they're not positive, if they're not productive, if they're not progressive, if they don't have the potential for growth, then what will happen to us? What will happen to you? What will happen to me? What will happen to the generations to come, if they are to come? So, I want you to think about, this is a image, if people know the famous children's book by Shel Silverstein, The Giving Tree. How many people have read that book? Yes. Yes. I got a hand clap for that. Almost everybody raised their hand on it. Yes, that's one of my favorite books because it pretty much says it all. If you take, and you don't give, then at some point, this is just basic math. You don't have to believe in any kind of political, this is not about any political party. Anybody knows that once you take, if there's a limited resource of something, and you just keep taking, and you don't replenish it, this is basic. That's like first grade math, right? Maybe even kindergarten math. That's not going to work. That equation's not going to work, right? So we have to think about, again, the notion of intersubjectivity. I want you to go home and I want you to make a list of all the work and people that it took to get you sitting in the seat that you're sitting in right now. How did you get here at Sonoma State? What did it take? Who did it take? And do you think you have a responsibility to provide that same seat for someone else? Is that important? To fill these seats in the future with other people, right? And to think about not only intersubjectivity, but regeneration through collectivity, through connection, through regenerating natural resources and processes of, right, possibility for growth, expansion, not contraction, not my group, my peeps, my small bubble, but expand. Not contract, but expand. Make the arms go wide. People, family, teachers, coaches, friends, classmates, any others. But look at that list and tell me what your relation, think about what your relation is to all the people on that list that made it possible for you to be here. So, being in community, and this is from, I don't know if you all are using the same, I don't know if this is the book, but this was the University 238 book. And I think that the ideas must be quite similar. Commitment. Make a commitment to that expansion, that notion, that thinking about the dancing mind, the collective. Acceptance is really important, crucial. Mindfulness, that's that exercise about, who made your shoes, who made your clothes, who harvested your food, mindfulness. And of course, again, emboldened here, concern, caring. Ethics, meaning responsibility, and peace. So, last term I'll leave you with, in each of us, there is a little of all of us. Haptic is a term that means touch. It's about the sense of touch. And in a book called The Undercommons, Stefano Harney and Fred Moten talk about their theory of the undercommons, meaning the community that we all live in. And in that, they say that, quote, hapticality or love, for them, essential to the undercommons community, is, quote, the feel that no individual can stand and no state abide. Though forced to touch and be touched, to sense and be sensed in that space of no space, though refuse sentiment, history, and home. Refuse caring. Although people refuse to care, refuse to acknowledge history, refuse to expand, open up their arms, and expand their notion of home. We, notice the pronoun use there, we feel for each other. We need to touch. We need hapticality or love in our communities, in our collective. So this is a cluster, is that what they call it, Alvin? What do they call it? Word cloud, thank you. Right, exactly, thank you. So think about what are some examples of community. How can we create more community? How can we broaden, expand this notion of community? Now that's how it will work. What do you know about community? How do you define community? What do you think the purpose is of community? What are the most important aspects of community to you? What do you think works the best in a community, in a collective? Do you think there are limits or restrictions to community? Is there anything negative about a community? And what do you think would be the benefits for you and for others in the kind of community that you would envision? The kind of productive, again, community that would have the potential for growth, the potential for regeneration, duplication, the multiplication is really, I'm on the math thing. How do we create the kind of community that Morrison is talking about, a dancing mind community, where we dance as individuals but also as a group? That around the peace, the dove peace in the earth is, be the change you wish to see in the world. What kind of change do we need to see? And how will it manifest? How will you play a role in manifesting a transformation, a positive transformation of our society and a community of, you see those beautiful children there, multicultural, different, but kindred, connected, and working to preserve the earth. So that is my, those are the words that I would like to leave you with. Really, I always like to leave my students with the idea of touch. Caring is about not being afraid to touch, as Fred and Stefano said. So my final offering to you is to ask you to turn to the person next to you and to touch them. If you're not sitting next to a person, that's bad. That's bad already. So get on up, yes, and find somebody. I'm going to get on down because I'm bad too. Look at me. Seriously, turn to the next person and touch. Why aren't you all touching? What the heck? What the heck? Get on up. Get up. Yes. Yes. No way. No way. Oh, okay. Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you.